Good evening, fellow listeners, and welcome to the DeFi Collective at Let's Talk Radio with Alex Jewell and Robert Vaughn. This is a show where we discuss all things having to do with decentralized finance, crypto, blockchain, et cetera, et cetera. Today, we're going to explore social media, surveillance capitalism, and how they affect our society. As you know, as we speak, there are 4 billion people actively using different forms of social media, most of them on Facebook. There's 295 million just in the US. Social media in the US has what's called the penetration is 90%. That means 90% of people are on social media, which is just about everybody. Of course, Facebook is a leading platform, and we're going to get into some of that and talk about why. So without further hesitation, I'm going to say, Alex, take it away. Tell us what this social media thing is all about and why we should care.
Yeah, it's going to be big. Get in now. Social media is going to be huge. I mean, the crazy thing with social media is that it's become essentially the conduit for information, right? It's become like this information highway where when it started, you think about the early days of MySpace and things like that, or even before that, forums and things like that. It was more of actually connecting with your friends instead of arguing with your enemies. But it was like, here's a picture of me doing something that I've gotten to put on the internet. And that's really how the concept started. But the moment that advertisers and ways of making money off of it became more apparent, and our use of them became more excessive, especially with the onset of smartphones, where you're always connected to your social media, not just when you have a browser window open. The opportunities became endless in terms of how much money can be made from getting us to be addicted and competing, because all these apps on your phone, the more apps that enter the marketplace, the more competition there is for every second of your day. And these social media giants recognize this. That's why a lot of them are in trouble for acquiring too many other ones, because if they can acquire more seconds of your day by acquiring even their competitors or even non-competitors, just other apps that you're using actively and that billions of people are using, or millions of people, they're stealing more seconds of your day that they can then make money off of advertising. Where this is really interesting to us, not just because of the surveillance capitalism side of it, but where it's interesting to us is, of course, the economic and political implications of how does this influence people's knowledge about the world, about politics, and how does it influence them, their decisions, right? How does it influence their behavior? Because ultimately, we're advocates for the decentralization of power and control, and taking ownership back of not just our finances, but our own decisions, our own data. And so this is a really interesting subject for us.
Yeah, and I just want to add that, with social media, one of the reasons that it is so concerning is because, with advertising, it used to be, they would flash buy popcorn in the theater at 1/40th of a second, and you get these subliminal messages. Well, it's gone so far beyond that that it's ridiculous. For instance, you remember Pokemon Go? They had this game called Pokemon Go, and we talked about this on a previous program, but I'll just kind of reiterate. Well, Pokemon Go seemed like a little harmless kid game, but Pokemon Go was a game by Google. And the game, beneath the game, was to see if they could manipulate people to be in certain places at certain times. Well, Pokemon Go was an experiment, and what they finally figured out was that, not only can we send Alex discount coupons when he's close by a Burger King, but we can also make sure that he goes by that Burger King.
Okay.
And so by, different cues on your phone, taking your data and finding out what moves you in a certain direction, both, literally and physically, they were able to, take you and place you somewhere where they wanted you to be. which could even be the voting booth. You know,
Right.
Obama was very successful with that, and then Trump, through Cambridge Analytica, was even more successful. You know,
Right.
So it's not just social media, you know, sharing pictures. It's that when you put something on social media, there's a data extraction that takes place, and they can tell, you know, if I show Alex a certain thing, you know, he gets a smile, you know, and they take all these data points from your face and from your mannerisms and what you say, and they know what kind of motivates you. And they also did some experiments called contagion experiments. Facebook did some, I want to say 8-9 years ago, where they said, well, let's see if we can take Alex's attitude and transfer it over to Robert, you know, and through certain posts that they sent me, and certain cues that they got from Alex on how to manipulate him, then they can also make me like Alex or dislike Alex through what's posted on my feed. So this is done through the extraction of data. I say the extraction rather than collection because they don't do it with your permission. You know, they actually extract your data that you know very little about. I used to have a Nest thermostat. So I find out that there was a microphone in the Nest thermostat. Why the hell would there be a microphone in my thermostat?
Right.
Unless someone wanted to extract data and hear what I was talking about, you know, and you know, I mean, it's so weird now. It's almost like you can think something, you know, because I've, you know, bought a refrigerator recently, and I was like, as soon as I started thinking about it, like it started popping up. I said, no, it's not possible. But I don't know. Maybe I looked on one site.
It will be. I mean, they're openly working on that, and you know, brain interfaces they're not far off. I mean, obviously, you know, you've got people like Elon Musk that are actively developing them to the point. I mean, they're pretty much at completion at this point. And you know, these are the same people. Elon Musk recently also talked about putting advertising and like billboards in space. Like these are already thoughts that they have of like.
So when you go to space, he'll already own the ad
right
territory.
You know, they're already going to make a killing on mining up there, but he's already thinking like, where, you know, investors, where else can we have value, right? If we have a tourism industry built around going to space, as if they're not going to make enough money on that already, we're going to add billboards along the way. You know, what's the best drink to have in space? Mountain Dew, you know, and like these are the ubiquity of advertising is where we run into issues, because how do we decide if something's innocent advertising versus influential advertising or misinformation advertising, right?
Right.
Something can be presented as an ad and people can have financial incentive to advertise that idea. But if you have advertising that's ubiquitous, and that advertising, because of its ubiquity, has a great actual real effect on how people perceive the world and how they perceive information,
right,
then you can manipulate that advertising with enough money. You know, you look at how much the candidates and spent on advertising, you know, and you look at like Trump pay, you know, he spent $107 million starting in 2019 for the 2020 election. And Biden wasn't far behind at 94 million. So when you look at how they're spending, that's exponentially more than what they spend on other forms of advertising.
And that was just getting started. And that was
just the year before. You look at like 2018, every year they were pouring, you know, millions and millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars into just making sure that their message was ubiquitous, right? And now you look at reports, we've talked about this before, right? The 12 people that had they were responsible for somewhere around 65% of all misinformation regarding the vaccine recently.
Yeah, 12 people.
And that's how these things spread, right? Because social media is not just this innocent sharing of information between friends anymore. It's a place that we are constantly, that we have much harder a job of determining from that stream of information what's real and what isn't.
What's real and what isn't.
And what's influenced and what isn't, right? What's organic and what isn't, what's real and what isn't. And when you have that issue where you've been turned upside down into an ecosystem that you can't leave, and you're being bombarded with information, and you haven't been given the tools or, you know, even the motivation to care where else to look or how to critique those things, you suddenly become a victim of something much bigger, right? A much bigger set of agendas. And that's where I think we have the most ethical questions.
Right. And, you know, surveillance capitalism is something relatively new because Shoshana Zuboff, professor emerita at Harvard, I believe, has done extensive research on surveillance capitalism. And just recently, you know, she put a name to it, you know, because nobody really knew what to call it, you know, the extraction of data. You know, for instance, this is her definition, you know, surveillance capitalism is a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. A parasitic economic logic in which the production of goods and services is subordinated to a new global architecture of behavior modification. I mean, this is exactly what it is. And she goes on to say a rogue mutation of capitalism marked by concentrations of wealth, knowledge, and power unprecedented in human history. I mean, it's unprecedented. You got Zuckerberg, the guy that runs Google, and Bezos, probably, and a couple more people probably have half the money in the world. I mean, it's totally ridiculous, you know. And you know, we're living now. We're starting to live in a surveillance economy where the most valuable thing that companies get is the extraction of data, and the thing that makes it so insidious is it happens without your knowledge. And most people aren't even aware that it's going on. When you go on Facebook, if you ever had your phone on and that little Facebook thing dings in your doctor's office or something, it's like everybody wakes up, you know. It's like two cops sitting in a restaurant and the radio goes off, man. They're like ready to go, you know. And it's like, I'm like, man, this is like the bell, you know, the classical conditioning, you know, we studied in high school about the dogs, you know, you ring the bell and the dog starts to salivate, you know. It was like you ring the bell and the people start to salivate for their Facebook, you know. And it's really crazy, you know. And it's gone to a level I think that most people aren't aware of. And you know, as Shoshana Zuboff says, you have to name it before you can tame it, you know, because if it's happening without your knowledge, you don't really know how your data is being extracted, when you put a picture up, they analyze your facial expressions. You know, if they, you know, put a piece of barbecue rib up and you get a big smile, then they kind of know you probably like barbecue. You know, if there's fear, they can detect fear. You know what I'm saying? And the thing about the algorithms are mathematical models that incorporate artificial intelligence that tend to learn that things that you like, they will send you more things that you like, but also things that you don't like, because you'll respond more to things that are negative than things that are positive. And you know, we talked about this before too. That's why you had Black Lives Matter, you know, protests in places where they didn't have Black people, you know, and you had, you know, people attacked the Capitol, and it's kind of like their fault, but in a way, they kind of got manipulated, you know, and a lot of people got manipulated, you know. So I think, you know, surveillance capitalism and data analytics bear some responsibility for that. I mean, it's not like they can, and this stuff is powerful, man. I mean, it is so powerful. You know, we talked about last week how, you know, there was a thing going around when COVID first came out. Well, this doctor from Africa said Black people couldn't catch it. So all the Black people are like, oh yeah, we can't get it. You know, I'm like, dude, and it's amazing that people actually believe that. And then, the thing with light, swallowing light, or I mean, and that people actually believe that, and you can go on.
Magnetism. I mean, you think about the magnetism thing, like
Yeah,
nobody asks like
particles. Yeah.
how, like, and this is, I mean, I think what's interesting too is, so Zuboff talks, I think in her book, earlier book, probably early 2000s even, but she talks about essentially 4 reasons why, or she talks about the reasons how they got away with it, right? Because a lot of people ask, well, like, how did this happen, right? How do we end up in this situation? And one of them is the fact that even liberals, regardless of political spectrum, where you are in America at least, there's still been this like major push to allow self-regulation of the market. You don't want to impede on, technological progress. And so even liberals, neoliberals, have allowed this like free market to do whatever it wants to, allowed companies to say, we'll just put out a report on what we think is important, and there hasn't been enough connection between what the companies have done in isolation, what they've self-reported on, and what the government does about it, because the government had no idea over the last 50 years, I think, of what's been going on. And that's evident every time that they bring Zuckerberg in and ask him questions. This is a serious issue, right? I mean, even
he looks at him like, I can't. He looks at him like, I can't believe
the look on his face.
I can't believe you guys don't know anything about the internet.
So the FTC refiled their antitrust lawsuit with Facebook because they're essentially said he has openly this idea of buy or bury, constantly buying the competition, acquiring them, instead of allowing competition, which is inherently illegal according to our system. It's not so much a free market anymore. If your American dream is to just sell your company to something larger within a couple of years of you having a good idea, right? I think that's pretty dystopian, actually, of like, I had a really good idea. I went on Shark Tank and the sharks were like, in 2 years, we can sell this to Google. You know what I mean? Like, this is, I think we've run into an issue here where it's like, maybe the free market was somewhat of a lie if we can't actually regulate it to the point where small businesses can actually thrive, right? Instead of just being fodder for like just having a big buyout and then thinking of a new idea. And so she talks about this issue that even liberals have accepted this. And it's been steadily growing since 2001 as well. This was the other issue, that we had 9/11. We realized that we had to have some sort of surveillance, right? And so that was used a lot by the right to start creating a lot more surveillance in general. And so
Democrats went along with it. The lefties went along with it.
And yeah, right, exactly. Both sides had their reasons for why this was okay.
Right.
And what happened is 2 other main reasons that I think we're at now. One is that even those of us further left have this, like, there's this idea of like not impeding progress, right? Of like, if this is technological advancement of getting chips in your brain, of being able to, talk to your thermostat, like, don't even get in the way of it. And I think this is where decentralization is really important and why I care so much about the right emerging technologies. I have no issue with emerging technologies. I work in tech. I think these are really important technologies that will be really useful. We have to make sure that we protect humans first. We have to make sure that we have a human-focused economy in order to allow those things to be healthy, right? And I think this is where we have to figure out, how do we actually draw lines in sand and decide what our priorities are, so that we don't end up in a dystopian future where our chips have, our brains have chips constantly advertising to us, and we have billboards in space, right? I think this is where we have to figure out, what do we do about it? And I think because we ended up with no other alternatives in the process, we're like, even to, we do everything with the internet, right? We do everything with our smartphone, with the internet. Half the people's smartphones are owned by Google, the other half are owned by Apple. Like, every piece of our connectivity to our healthcare, to our banking, to everything we do, that ubiquity I was talking about, everything we do is connected in some way to one of these tech giants. And so there's really no way of escape. And so they create this ignorance of how it works. they create this ignorance of what they're doing with it and how they profit off of it, unless you're going to read a 400-page SEC document.
Mhm.
And then it's in order to do anything, in order to participate in your healthcare and get rewards, in order to, exercise and get rewards, in order to join your gym and get a cheaper price, in order to watch movies, in order to do anything in the modern world, in the modern Western world, you have to be connected to these tech giants. And so we don't have the regulation to protect us, but we have to be joined to them, or else we live off the grid like a nomad. And
Right.
There's really no in between. And so we have to do something fundamentally different. We have to fundamentally change how these things work, or like I said, it's pretty dystopian, the direction we're heading with it.
But they have to be regulated. And I think one of the things that's happening now is, they've gotten so much power, and people I know when I was younger, people always talk about, the government's going to take control. They're going to control your life. They're going to know everything and have all your information. Well, while we're over here looking at the government, the corporate guys are the ones who were successful at doing this.
Right.
And the government, and it's a very technology driven. It's a very technology driven technology.
Right.
If you don't really understand it, if you were to go to Congress right now and the Senate, especially the Senate, you were ask 100 senators, describe AI for me. Describe surveillance capitalism. Describe an artificial intelligence neural network and how that manipulates people. And you probably got a few, but not too many.
Right.
So and the reason I think they haven't regulated it is because they don't really understand it. And Zuckerberg will go up there and he'll confuse them even more. And then he'll say, "Oh, well, I don't get it. We're good guys, and we'll try to be good guys, but I don't get it.
We're just trying to connect people.
We're just trying to connect people. We want everybody to be friends. How many friends do you have?
Don't you like Friends?
Yeah, and I found out something recently. I had a friend who he said, well, I like to drive. I want to get a car. He had kind of semi-retired. He bought some Microsoft stock like 35 years ago. So he's kind of in a good shape. He kind of semi-retired. He said, well, I want to go to work. He said, so what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to go out to California. He said, they're going to fly me out and I'm going to take one of those Google cars and I get to drive it back. And I'll drive it around for 20 hours a week and they'll pay me all this money. I said, oh, that sounds like fun, man. I said, so what does the Google cars do? He said, well, we drive. And I said, those are cars that map, the streets and map the houses. He said, oh, no, that's just a small part of what they do. Is what we do is when we ride past your house, we extract your information from your Wi-Fi.
Right.
And then it's uploaded to a mainframe computer. And this is how we get tons of data. Mm-hmm. He said, but don't tell anybody. I said, I won't have to because I'm sure you will.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's so many little things like that aren't.
Yeah, I mean, have you seen those cars riding around? I thought they just took pictures. He said, no, man. He said, no. Wi-Fi belongs to everybody.
Well, they've been sued tons of times for this, but they're making more money off of doing it than they're paying in fines, right? And this is the other fundamental issue, is that even how we find these companies retroactively, right? We reactively find them after they've done it, which is like not great, right? And they have no problem paying a $50 million fine here, 20 million fine there. Who cares? They're making billions off of the data that they have, right?
Like stealing a Marvin Gaye song, it's like stealing a Marvin Gaye song. You make 100 million and they sue you for 10 and you give them 8, right. Give them 8 and walk away with 90.
Cost of doing business, right? It's like,
yeah.
It's like how the mob.
It's a pretty good investment, invest 8 million and make 100,
Right. It's like how the mob has to have people on payroll in every office. They don't care if they're making enough off of paying those people off. And they're making enough off the business, they don't care what the costs of business are. You know what I mean? And so I think, really what it comes down to is these companies have become so large. Their business models are based around our data in ways that most people don't even realize, because there's literally no reason most people would know, like that car. there's so many little things like that, where I think we talked about this before. Now you can look up an entire map of everybody's Wi-Fi network and see what it's named, where it's at, so there's people with like their full name in the Wi-Fi name, and it shows where they live, like I mean, this data is so pertinent. That's how Google, your phone knows what your home address is, because they know your schedule and they know where you're at and when you have meetings and when you're at home. And all of this information is constantly stored and then used, right? They're not storing the information for you later, so you know where you live. You already know where you live. Why are they storing that? They're storing that because it's helpful to them to know how to advertise to you.
And the cars are also tracked electronically and also so visually. And it used to always baffle me. I said, well, this guy, he committed 2 murders in Arkansas, drove to Texas, then to Miami, Florida, and then they caught him in Bangor, Maine. And I'm like, well, how the hell did they know he was in Bangor, Maine?
Yeah.
And they tracked his car, they tracked his phone, and there's a couple of cases where people rode up and the cops were waiting on them. And, so, data, there are a lot of people that push this technology for their own use. I mean, you can, if you don't deactivate your location in your iPhone, anyone can look in there and see all the places that you've been. You know what I'm saying? And that data, if you walk in an airport now, they also extract data.
Yep.
For security purposes. So like you said, 9/11 kind of opened the floodgates for, and they talk about the NSA, Snowden talks about the NSA. Man, the NSA got nothing on Google and Facebook.
Well, that's the thing. I think a lot of people, this is what's really interesting to me and something I've been thinking about a lot recently. People who don't understand how these things work will almost always attack the government, right? And they think of the government as like this nucleus of a few people who have a lot of power. And the reality is that actually a good portion of the country works for government agencies. I mean, the government is actually a bunch of really separate organizations. In fact, this causes issues a lot, where the arm is not talking to the leg. And so you've got organizations like the NSA, the CIA. You have organizations like this that are, they have their own nefarious things going on, where it's like you have NSA or CIA or FBI helicopters that fly over cities, and they're actually documenting a lot of things about, they'll do circles around a certain city, and they're actually collecting a ton of data in that process. Right. And then, but it usually doesn't have to do with you. It has to do with like somebody they're looking for, or regular surveillance where something stands out. Right. I mean, but these organizations, there's some overlap, but for the most part, they have very different jobs. Right. And so you think about like how people have attacked the vaccine thing, right? They're like, I don't trust the government. Well, it's like, okay, I don't trust most of the senators or most of the Congress people in terms of like giving me medical information. But if I'm looking at the FDA or, the CDC or something, and you look at how many people on staff in those organizations or how many people those organizations pay for their information and for their work, the majority of them are, public servant scientists who make like 50 to 60K a year and like genuinely care. They've had full careers doing,
and they're in it because they want to do good.
Exactly. They're not, their face isn't plastered on anything. They're not getting like payouts for anything exciting. Like they spend their careers making almost like very average money because they genuinely care about science of some kind, right? And they specialize in something and they care about the world, right? Most people don't have maybe access to STEM fields that closely. They're several degrees removed. They don't know a researcher personally or a scientist personally who like wakes up every morning and starts talking about it and goes to bed every night talking about it. What their specialty is. But the government is fragmented into a bunch of very different organizations with very different jobs, comprised of very different levels of people and things, right? Companies, on the other hand, every part of a company, sometimes these companies are as large as governments. Every part of them are in direct communication with each other, following one goal, right? One goal compared to the fragmentation of the government, but one goal of a company is what? To make money. That's it.
As much money as we can.
That's the goal. Yeah. Every piece of these companies, however large they are, whether it's Amazon with 800,000 employees, or Apple, or, you know, all of these that have country-sized amounts of employees. All of these organizations have one goal, and they're united around that goal. And if what it takes is to monitor every bit of information they can about what your life entails, so they can advertise to you or use your data in some, you know, profitable way, there's literally no regulation stopping them from doing that, because you've agreed to it.
Well, you know, just to interject here for a minute, you know how his divorce came about? Well, Israel manufactures software that can go in any phone, you know, and they license this out to different people. Well, I guess apparently Saudi Arabia got this software, and Trump said, you know what, this Bezos is a real jerk. You know, he's got the Washington Post. He's trying to nail you. He's trying to nail me. Let's get him.
Right. So
he goes through Bezos's phone, and he sees that he's cheating on his wife, and they post the pictures. And they post the pictures. I'm saying, this is the richest guy in the world, and a software program took him down. Right. Or caused him to get a divorce. Didn't take him down. Caused him to lose a little money, and then I think 2 months later he was back being the richest guy in the world after he paid her off.
Yeah. Imagine losing half of everything you have to your, you know, to your ex-wife, and you still end up being the richest person in the world in a few months.
Richest guy in the world. Yeah. So
middle of a pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it, you know, and it's data is sort of the new frontier. I mean, you know, we talked about, we were you know, there was a capitalism. We have talked about capitalism, you know, and we were in an oil economy for a long time, and then the internet economy. Well, now we're in a data economy. Bless you. And the data determines who wins and who loses. You know, and I think, you know, a lot of people worry that a lot of, you know, of the people that really own, you know, like Amazon Web Service and Facebook, and they may have gotten too powerful for nobody can really touch them now.
Right.
You know, and I think that's the you know, that's the risk that you run, you know, if you don't regulate these companies, is that they'll reach a point where, you know, you try to regulate them, and they said, no, you can't do that. Nobody will vote for it, you know, and they got everybody in Congress on the payroll, you know, and nobody will vote for it. You know, I think we see that now a lot in the Republican Party, you know, where they're all, you know, they've been, a lot of them get money from the same places, you know, and
a lot of them pay their fines when they get caught, and they just keep going. You know, you look at like all these Republican commentators, you look at half of the Republican Party, you know, people that work for them, almost, I mean, a large fraction of them have been fined or in trouble at some point for some sort of campaign fraud, or like some sort of ethical issue of like, oh, you worked for this company, and then you're on the board, and then you were like, you know, then all of a sudden you were on the committee for like regulating that. You know, you look at like this issue, and I think this is why we talk so much about how can we, you know, because we've talked a lot about regulation so far here. And I think when you bring it back to decentralization, what does regulation look like in a decentralized economy? And I think really what it comes down to is governance. I think there's a lot of tools baked into a decentralized economy and decentralized world that allow for the proper governance and the rules, and for things to not even go through if they break the rules. Right.
Yeah, and that's blockchain. You've got a ledger, and you can write your smart contracts or your smart legislation, so that certain things will fly and certain things don't fly.
And have a true democratic way of everybody agreeing on what that legislation looks like, right? What's fair, regardless of party and those parties advertising to you and politicians making promises. Stop making promises, write some smart contracts that follow the rules of what you promised, right? You know, and I think this is where we have a really exciting opportunity. Instead of just going along with, here's what progress is giving us, you know, we're accepting a world where we're controlled by, you know, monopolies and in late stage capitalism. But instead, let's imagine a world where we have all these developing technologies and what else comes after them, but it's a world where we truly own them, and we own the rights to our own data, and we own the knowledge of how it's used, because it's suddenly a bottom-up economy that we own.
Mhm.
And I think that's really cool.
Right. I think it requires, we got to get some nerds in the legislature, man. Somebody that really kind of understands the technology and really, because I mean, I won't call any names, but I've talked to elected officials, and this is like so far beyond them.
Yeah.
They're just worried about, if they're in the Congress, they're worried about raising enough money, since they have to run every 2 years.
Right.
And if they're in the Senate, they're worried about making enough friends so when they retire, they could go from, like Mitch McConnell, from 2 million to 50 million in 4 or 5 years, and that's basically what they're concerned with. And I think a lot of times, technology kind of passes people by sometimes.
Mhm.
Just like the internet, and it took a while for everything to catch up. And I see, surveillance capitalism and data acquisition now. It's kind of people are just now are starting to wake up and become aware of it. And not a lot of people, just people that may work in the business, or people that do a lot of investigation, or people that have a reason to really know what it is,
Yeah.
and actively go out and seek and want to know about it. I mean, I think surveillance capitalism is one of the most important things, the acquisition of data and the monetization of human experience and data is probably one of the most important things that we face as a society,
Yeah.
because it puts a lot of power in very few hands.
Yeah.
And I think to democratize that, I mean, the last time you had this kind of concentration of wealth, you had the French Revolution,
Right.
where you had kings and serfs. There was
Yep.
nobody in between. You were either royalty in Europe, or you weren't.
Yep.
And people said, well, there's got to be a better way. Let's look to democracy and capitalism.
Yeah.
Capitalism's all there. Let's look to democracy, and it worked pretty good for a while.
Right.
Until about I'd say about 40 or 50 years ago.
Mhm.
When it was after World War II. The United States had destroyed all the industry and just about most of the countries, and that's why we had this big boom, because we obliterated Japan. Germany knocked out the United Kingdom, and then they came back, and we in France and the United Kingdom knocked out Germany's That's what they bombed, factories, man. It was like a money war,
Exactly.
on factories. But they said, for God's sake, don't touch the oil wells. That's
Yeah.
where the
And it was a
money's
war
coming
like
from.
that, World War I, that angered
Yeah.
Germany so much to begin with, right?
Uh-huh.
Because at some point, Hitler was able to, he was able to convince people like, hey, wait a second, like we shouldn't be treated like this. We shouldn't be, losing our industry. And he was like, it's all of their other fault for controlling us and saying we can't be successful, right?
Right.
And then, of course, with the Second World War, the same thing happened. But the moment that those other countries got their acts together, and started thinking about even better forms of democratization than we had. We
and I think, in terms of economics, we had all the manufacturing, and back then that's where the money was. The real money was from manufacturing. Right. It was from oil.
Yeah.
We had all the manufacturing, so everybody wanted dollars. We were still in the gold standard, so they start giving us gold, and we gave them dollars.
Yep.
We had accumulated probably at least half the gold in the world, and we had all these countries that owed us money, and they said, we're not paying you back. We're going to have our own currency, and we'll just we'll have our own currency, and we don't need dollars. And I think that's probably was very instrumental in Nixon taking us off the gold standard.
Yep.
Because they knew they weren't going to ever get that money back.
Yeah, they had to start creating value.
Created value, some other way. And so we said, well, we'll do it with speculation, man. Let's we'll figure out how to do it with the stock market,
Yeah.
Screw gold. Who needs gold? Nobody needs gold. But I think, this time, and that's the last 50 years, 40 years, credit, everybody buys things with credit.
Yeah.
Most the wealthy people, they never use their own money for anything.
Yeah.
I know a gentleman personally who owns several car dealerships, and he owns 2 banks. So when he buys a car dealership, guess where he gets the money from?
The
He
bank.
gets a line of credit on his bank. He doesn't even have to use real money.
Yeah.
And all the interest that he pays in his car dealership to his bank goes in his pocket. That's where money gets created. You know, when you pay interest on money, that's where money really gets created. You know, the treasury, you know, the bonds, or there's something called rehypothecated bonds where
Yep.
a bond trader I can get bonds, and I can get 100 billion in bonds, and I can loan that 100 billion out 7 or 8 different times.
Right. Yeah.
As long as the 8 guys
virtual.
don't ask, as long as the 8 guys don't all want their money at the same time,
right,
I can kind of keep this going, and which is, what happened, I guess, in 29 when everybody wanted their money.
Yeah. Well, this is what's crazy to me. When a lot of people attack crypto because they don't understand it, they attack it because in their head it's some sort of imaginary currency, right? And you have things like apothecated bonds that are literally this virtualization of value.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy,
multiple times over, right? And when you think about how we do business with the current US dollar, 90% of it is virtual, 90% of it is imaginary, 90% of it is completely made up. And yet cryptocurrency, most of it is built on actual real things. There's a real idea of scarcity, right? It's digital, but I think that's a whole other discussion around like what creates tangibility, right? In a digital ecosystem, because obviously so much of our lives are valued digitally at this point. And so when we rethink value, because we've obviously been rethinking value for a long time, like you said, we went off the gold standard. We had to rethink about what the dollar even was. And from there, we had to start rethinking about how do we create value out of thin air from that? How do we create credit, and how do we create lines of credit? How do we approve things? And how do we think about bonds? And how do, like all of these virtualizations of the dollar, these layers on top, created complexity that created issues like the 2008 crash, and who knows what's next, that because none of those issues have ever been solved. And what we're doing now is just not sustainable. So if we rethink about that economic standard around what creates value, and we do it in a way that we create value owned by the individual and have, sovereign individual, a person who has ownership over their own data and over their own, digital economy, then I think this is really powerful.
It is, yeah. And it's I know a guy said to me once, he said, well, if you divide up all the money in the world and gave everybody an equal amount, he said in 5 years, we'd all have it back again. Because we understand the system and you guys don't.
Yeah.
And then he said, don't hate the player, hate the game, And it's the game that's rigged.
They made the system. So of course
they made it.
Of course they understand the system better. They made it for themselves.
They made the system, right. And
there's no inhibition. There's no issues with, nobody was like, hey, you shouldn't do that.
Yeah. And if you don't really understand, what hypothecated treasuries are, and you don't really understand that a lot of corporations that sell bonds to the government, you can't even find out who they are. And a lot of corporations the government buys bonds from, you can't find out who they are.
Right.
So I mean, to say the game is rigged, I mean, it's an understatement,
Well, they're buying, I think they're still buying junk bonds. I think the moment we started buying junk bonds around the, the pandemic, I never heard of like some, arbitrary date in the future where they're going to like, we're going to stop buying junk bonds now. Right. So now we've crossed another line of like, not only is the government buying bonds, right? A very distinct crossing of the line between, interest.
Right. And I think, since, one of the reasons a lot of people aren't too crazy about decentralized finance and blockchain and crypto is that there's a ledger. and you couldn't do rehypothecated treasuries if they were on a ledger, because you know that if you sold already or you lent out, they don't sell them, they lend them out, and you pay interest. If you already lent out 100 million in treasuries, and somebody else tells you they want 100 million, the blockchain wouldn't let you do it, because
Right. They'd look at the record and say, no, you already
lent it out. Yeah, so I think that's one reason a lot of people don't like it, but I think that capitalism has, I'd say, since probably the 40s or 50s, there's a wealth transfer that's taken place, and it's all around the world. Up until maybe the 50s or 60s, everybody would say, oh, we're communists, we're the Union Soviet Socialist Republics, we're not capitalists, we're communists, and we're this and we're that. Well, everybody now is a capitalist.
Yep.
And the reason people hate China so much, because China are the best capitalists in the world. What I'm saying?
It's true. Yeah.
They manipulate their currency. They've got their own digital currency already.
Yep.
They got rid of the Bitcoin farming and mining, got rid of Bitcoin mining, and their people don't like them because they succeeded in capitalism, playing within the framework of the rules, and they outdid a lot of other capitalists. And for a long time, the United States was at the top of the heap, when it came to having all the gold and all the money, and that's not the way it is anymore. And I think, with blockchain, capitalism has kind of sort of fostered a wealth transfer, like nothing else we've seen in history, until, like you said before, the French Revolution, where the king owned everything. And if you wanted something, he'd loan it out to you. He'd lend you some land to farm on, and you had to pay tax on that and pay rent. But, I see that, the path we're on, we can't continue on this path.
Not sustainable.
Yeah, it's not sustainable, because you have to have, in order for people to make money, you have to have people to have enough money to spend, so that money can go to the people to make money. But if you take all the money out of the system, it's just at the top. There's nobody else to make money off of.
Yeah.
There's nobody to buy the goods and services that the people at the top manufacture, so they can make more money.
Yeah. How often do you see a slump in the market because of, people not moving? This actually happened earlier in the pandemic, where we suddenly had a liquidity problem. We had a volume problem, and the market was not hurting because there wasn't trust in some of the companies. That's definitely an issue, but the market was hurting. There was an issue in the market because a bunch of whales bought up a ton of stocks and then just sat there because it was a bottom. And so you saw no movement other than that. And all we've been able to do then is we've been able to, with capitalism in the unchecked manner that it's happened over time, is we've recreated a lot of the conditions that led to revolutions before. We see it even with the pandemic. Actually, it's pretty interesting when you compare this to what happened after the plague. And granted, after the plague, you had, some areas, 80% of the population had died, but overall you saw, half of Europe disappear during the plague. When the plague was somewhat over, suddenly you had a labor shortage, right? All of these businesses started building back up, but suddenly you had a labor shortage, and the people who were left were not going to work for what they were working for before, when they had, when there was somebody else to just throw in and replace them. Now people wanted fairer wages. And so you saw one of the steepest increases in wage increases in history happen. But of course, the nobility hated this. The nobility were like, we're not going to pay them more. And so what they did is they actually created limits on how much somebody could get paid. And then they made it illegal for you to not work. They actually forced the working class to work, and then put, caps on their wage increases. Yeah. We want to avoid situations like this, where the people who are in charge of the jobs, what's going to be left of them, are not also in charge of the regulation and the rules that are supposed to be there to help the worker, right? To protect the worker. And so this is where, back at our last episode, where we talked a lot about economy and a lot about work and what work's going to look like for the next 50 years. I think there's a lot of overlap between data and ownership of data, as well as work and ownership of work. And how do we distribute wealth in lieu of these changes?
Yeah. You know, it was, I remember after Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971, he instituted wage and price freezes, where you could not ask, you could not get a raise, and you could not raise a price unless it was okayed by the government.
Yep.
As a way to keep working people from making more money.
They seem fine with regulation when it when it benefits their bottom line.
Yeah, well, see, that's what I'm saying. You know, capitalism is supposed to be laissez-faire. That's with no government intervention, but the government always intervenes, but it's never to the benefit of the working people.
Right.
It's to the benefit of the corporation.
Yeah.
You know, and you can say, well, you know, corporations, if they create jobs, there'll be more better paying jobs for working people. But that's when you had corporations that had integrity.
Right.
You know, and I don't know if that, I mean, you actually used to have guys that, you know, Henry Ford actually paid his people, the going rate when he was manufacturing cars was $1.20 a day. For factory work, he raised this, they're paid to $5 a day. And I asked him, why did you do that? He said, so they could afford to buy the cars that they make. He said, I'll still have enough money. Believe me, he said, I'll still have enough money. But what that did was that there was a lot of disposable income. They were able to create more car jobs by paying people more. That actually helped, you know, pull us out of the Great Depression.
Yeah. Because
you had discretionary spending now. You know, and he realized that if he kept paying his people $1.25 an hour, and so what happened when he raised it to $5 an hour. So then General Motors, if they wanted to, the guys over there were saying, well, hell, you know, we're not going to work for $1.20. We want $5 an hour too. You know, and American Motors and everybody, I'm sure Mercedes-Benz in France and in Germany, you know, Peugeot in France, they all, you know, so it kind of made everybody pay a little more, and everybody had a little more spending power, buying power.
Right.
So it actually benefited the companies to raise the wages.
Yeah.
You know, and because then you've got people who can actually afford to buy what you're selling.
Right.
And in addition to, you know, I mean, you know, average person, if you pay them 4 times as much as they're making now, they're not just going to buy more cars. They're going to buy more shoes. They're going to buy more groceries. They're going to buy more toys at Christmas time. You know, they're going to buy more refrigerators. So it kind of, you know, gives the economy a good shot in the arm. You know, I think the real reason the economy didn't really tank in the bottom completely was because of the $600 a week unemployment, because people were spending that money.
Yeah.
And now that kind of, it kept manufacturing going to the point now they don't have enough people to manufacture the goods.
Right. Or major shortages.
Yeah. So I think, you know, in terms of, you know, how social media is affecting society, I think it can affect society in a good way. But I think like everything in these regulations, you know, I mean, you know, JP Morgan back in when they started the Bank of America, before there was a central bank, you know, the United States basically was broke. And they said, we got to have some sort of banking regulation, but this capitalism is getting out of control. He says, we don't have any money. The United States Treasury is empty. JP Morgan said, don't worry, boys. He said, I'll give you the money. He actually loaned money to the government. That's how much money he had. You know, because everybody, and the money was, and that's what happens when money gets concentrated.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like this cycle they go through, and we're like going through that cycle again. But you would hope that by now that we're smart enough to see, well, maybe something like decentralized finance, you know, a blockchain ledger, it will keep everybody honest.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the reason. That's the reason that economic, like almost episode, I think we referenced this, that new economic systems happen every so often, right? Every 300 to 500 years, we have a new economic system. The reason is because there's so many variables in society that shift and evolve and change that at some point you have, when you play out the whole story, when you play out the trajectory of something, you might have had like a high point. And now we're not at such a high point anymore with capitalism, right? We're at a point where we're like,
Mhm.
Is this going to work for the next 50 to 100 years? And of course, there's lots of people who will blindly scream yes. But the reality is that if history is any guide, and if our projections are any guide, and the current evolving issues that are actually here now are any guide, then the reality is that we have to do something different. We have to do something differently. We have to have something new that works better for the modern world.
Mhm.
And for a digital economy and a digital world that's even more integrated and even more further along that line than it is now.
Right.
And I think that's really what we have to take into consideration when you look at even people like Elon Musk, who's very much a capitalist, talking about UBI again this week, talking
Mhm.
about universal basic income. Even when those tech giants are like, we should probably pay people to just be a person in our economy that we're benefiting from.
Yeah, I mean, and when they talk about UBI, you know damn well he ain't gonna pay it. It's gonna come from the government.
Yeah.
And the way the government is gonna have it is they're gonna eventually raise tax on corporations.
Right.
And if you had 40 corporations made over $1 billion, didn't pay any tax, I mean, there's room there for everybody to pay their fair share.
Right. Exactly.
There's opportunity for everybody to pay their fair share. And I think, he's smart enough to realize, I'm sure he studied history and seen what happens when you have this wealth concentrated.
Right.
It's just an unsustainable system.
Yeah.
And if capitalism is to survive, it has to become more equitable.
Right.
Because most people that have money now, you have a lot of new money, but most of the money is old money. They inherited it.
Exactly. Yeah.
We used to call it the Lucky Gene Club, they're in the Lucky Gene Club,
Right.
and they inherited it,
Yeah.
So it's not like they did anything for the money. And there has to be some equity. So like something like UBI, universal basic income, is going to benefit everybody.
Right.
And people say, well, certain people are lazy and they don't work and that's why they're poor. I mean, a lot of poor people get up at 4 a.m. and catch 3 buses to be at a job that started at 7 o'clock.
It's a complete
They're
lie.
making $11 an hour and then walking halfway back home because
Yeah.
So I think for capitalism, an economic system becomes by its very nature, it's a political system.
Yeah.
And I think in order for democracy to survive and to prosper, I think there has to be more equity, and there has to be capitalism can be improved upon. I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think there's a lot of good aspects. But I think there's a lot of things that could be reworked and improved upon.
Right. We can still have a competitive economy, even more than what we have now, because like we've uncovered, there's not as much competition as you'd hope there would be.
Right.
And we can have real owners of capital rather than concentrated capital that causes, inequalities for everybody else. And if we can resolve those, the thing is, hey, if you don't like a lot of the progressive ideas that we have or a lot of the decentralization ideas, come up with an idea. But the reality is that we have to change, right? And so
we do,
if people are just arguing to conserve what exists, that's wrong. I can't agree with conservation, right? I can't control the conservatism of saying this is a beautiful thing that's clearly not working. And we're going to fight.
Let's get back to normal. Well, normal wasn't so great for a lot of people.
Let's get back to normal. No, let's think differently about the future. And if you think differently about the future and you have a different idea than me, then let's talk about it. That's exciting. But if your idea for the future is to just hope that this thing works out without any intervention, that's not going to work.
No, it never has, and capitalism's about, like you said, at that 400-year mark when, these economic systems start to self-implode and self-destruct, like feudalism, mercantilism, slavery, and they all have their run. And hopefully by now we could be smart enough, as a community, as not just a nation, but as a world, because everything now is worldwide. It's not like what China does over there doesn't affect us here, and the fact that, Africa now is the #1 country that uses cryptocurrency. That's why China is so friendly, because they want to get their currency in there because they kind of see where things are going.
Right.
Cardano was adopted by Ethiopia as the currency of choice for their country a couple of months ago. And as we talked about last week, Cardano's been doing pretty good lately.
Yeah.
So I think, there has to be some, some change and some integration. And I think DeFi is the only new financial system in the last 10,000 years that wasn't based, it's not based on fiat currency, i.e. coins and dollar bills. They may or may not be backed by something, because, a fiat currency, a dollar bill is just as good as a person that backs it. If you don't think that's true, go to South America and see some of those countries where, you get paid $100 today, but you have to buy crypto because tomorrow that 100 is going to be worth 72.
Yeah. Right.
That's why, they buy crypto. But great conversation, and I hope that we've been able to raise the awareness that, surveillance capitalism is going to have to be reined in. We're going to need legislation. Data acquisition is going to be necessary. It's, the technology has gotten past the legislation. This happens. It's going to have to be reined in. Just like monopolies. If monopolies were going the way they went, William Randolph Hearst in 1865 owned 1 million acres of land in Mexico, or was in Mexico, and had $265 million, which I don't even know what that would be in today's dollars. Well, that money didn't go away. That's why they say, well, his family only has this much. That money didn't go away. It's a lot more now than it was then. But, what eventually would have happened, you would have had 5 guys that owned everything, and everybody else in the world would have worked for them,
Yeah. Right.
And that's anytime you have wars, it's always about money.
Yeah.
This, the last wars in the last 100 years have been petroleum wars.
Yep.
Who controls the oil?
Yeah.
Next
Wars
you
of
may have
commodity.
you may have the data wars or something. I don't know, but hopefully, we can educate people and demonstrate how decentralized finance can actually be a benefit not only to democracy, but can make capitalism a more palatable economic system.
Yeah.
And that's about all I got. You any closing thoughts, Alex?
No, we nailed it.
Okay, yeah. Keep your eyes and ears open. Decentralized finance is what's happening. That's not going anywhere. You may not like Bitcoin, but a lot of people didn't like dollars that weren't based on gold. But that's where we're headed. And unfortunately, the rest of the world might get there faster than the United States. So we have some catching up to do.
Yeah.
All right. Well, again, thank you for watching. We appreciate you sharing your time with us, but unfortunately ours is up. So until we meet again, save some money and wear your mask. Okay. Have a good day.